Hello and welcome to this video on the history of the United States Civil War. The Civil War was a conflict that lasted from 1861 to 1865 and was fought primarily over the issue of slavery and states' rights. It resulted in the deaths of over 600,000 soldiers and civilians and is considered one of the most significant events in American history. To understand the Civil War, we need to go back to the early days of the American Republic, when the northern and southern states were still trying to define their relationship with each other. In the North, industrialization was on the rise, and many people were against the institution of slavery, which they saw as a hindrance to the development of the region. In the South, however, slavery was an integral part of the economy and way of life, with many plantation owners relying on the labor of enslaved people to cultivate crops such as cotton and tobacco. As the country grew and expanded westward, the issue of slavery became increasingly divisive. In the late 1850s, a number of states in the North had abolished slavery, while southern states sought to extend the institution into new territories. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. This act, known as Bleeding Kansas, led to violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, and further fueled the tensions between the North and South. In 1861, a number of southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The main reason for their secession was the election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, as president. Lincoln was seen as an anti-slavery candidate, and his election was seen as a threat by many in the South. The Confederacy was led by Jefferson Davis and included states such as South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal military installation in South Carolina. Lincoln called for volunteers to defend the Union, and both sides began to mobilize their armies. The war would eventually spread to most of the states, with major battles taking place in places such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Bull Run. In the First Battle of Bull Run, known in the South as First Manassas, on July 21, 1861, 35,000 Confederate soldiers under the command of Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson forced a greater number of Union forces or Federals to retreat towards Washington, D.C., dashing any hopes of a quick Union victory and leading Lincoln to call for 500,000 more recruits. In fact, both sides' initial call for troops had to be widened after it became clear that the war would not be a limited or short conflict. The Union had a number of advantages over the Confederacy, including a larger population, a more developed economy, and a better-equipped military. However, the Confederacy was able to hold its own for much of the war due to its strong military leaders, such as Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and its ability to mobilize large numbers of soldiers. One of the most significant events of the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in 1863. This document declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were to be considered free. However, it only applied to the southern states that were in rebellion against the Union. It was seen as a major turning point in the conflict and had a profound impact on the way the war was fought, as many African Americans enlisted in the Union Army in hopes of gaining their freedom. The end of the Civil War was marked by a series of significant battles that ultimately led to the defeat of the Confederacy and the preservation of the Union. One of the key turning points of the war was the Battle of Antietam, which took place in September 1862 in Maryland. This was the bloodiest single day of the war, with over 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. The Union emerged victorious from the battle, and it was a major setback for the Confederacy. The Union's victory at Antietam also allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were to be considered free. Another significant battle was the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in July 1863 in Pennsylvania. This was one of the largest battles of the war and resulted in over 50,000 casualties. The Union emerged victorious from the battle, and it is considered a turning point in the war. The Union's victory at Gettysburg was a major morale boost for the Union and marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The final major battle of the Civil War was the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, which took place in April 1865 in Virginia. This was the last major engagement of the war and resulted in the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Union's victory at Appomattox Courthouse marked the end of the Civil War and the preservation of the Union. These battles played a critical role in determining the outcome of the Civil War and had a lasting impact on the history of the United States. The Union's victories at Antietam, Gettysburg, and Appomattox Courthouse ultimately led to the defeat of the Confederacy and the preservation of the Union, and they stand as important milestones in American history. The aftermath of the Civil War was marked by a period of Reconstruction in which the federal government worked to rebuild the South and reintegrate it into the Union. After the Civil War, a number of amendments were made to the United States Constitution in order to address the issues that had led to the conflict and to provide greater protections for the rights of all Americans. The 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. This amendment marked a major turning point in American history and had a profound impact on the country's legal and social landscape. The 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves. It also provided equal protection under the law to all citizens, regardless of their race. The 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, granted the right to vote to all male citizens, regardless of their race. This amendment was a major step forward in the fight for civil rights and helped to ensure that all Americans had an equal say in the political process. These amendments, along with others that were passed during this time, helped to shape the legal and social landscape of the United States and played a critical role in the country's efforts to rebuild after the Civil War. They continue to be an important part of the Constitution and are still relevant today. Thanks for watching. Please check out our other videos.